How do you feel about the idea of potentially re-owning Qantas from a government perspective?
Well, I'm not sure we're at that point in the discussion. I think everyone's...
mooted, though.
I'm not exactly sure who by, but there's been a lot of hysterical discussion around Qantas, and I can understand that people are very emotional when we talk about Qantas as a national airline. But I think the first thing we need to do is to get all the facts on the table, to understand the current position, and to, as Joe Hockey has rightly said, look at whether or not the legislation needs to be reviewed with ownership limits, and whether or not that would make a difference to letting Qantas be more competitive in a very globally competitive environment.
But Alan Joyce has made clear, as the CEO of Qantas, that he doesn't think that the option that should be on the table is this idea of changing the foreign ownership restrictions, and that only leaves, from his perspective at least, the possibility of taxpayers' funds going into the airline. Is that something that should be on the table in your view?
Well, I think what Joe has suggested is entirely what we should be looking at in terms of Qantas and the foreign ownership limits. I think if we're talking about this issue, we need to look at all of the issues that mean that Qantas is less competitive. I think it also means we actually have to look at some of the industrial relations issues, which also go to the core of whether or not Qantas is competitive relative to airlines around the world. So there are lots of issues that I think need to be brought to the table. I think we need to do that in a fairly dispassionate way, and I think we need to be able to analyse it where everybody gets to put their perspective, and I'm sure that that's what will happen.
Tim Wilson, normally I'd go to somebody from the other side of politics to see where they sit, but let me go to you on this particular issue. What might you take issue with in some of the discussion around options in regards to Qantas?
Well, my issue would, of course, be that if Qantas seeks to get subsidies from the government and take money from taxpayers to buttress their profits and their position in the marketplace, that would be a disgraceful outcome. But I don't think that the coalition is going to end up there. I think Joe Hockey's position today was 100% right, putting out there the idea of removing the investment restrictions on Qantas, basically requiring them to have 51% local ownership.
Alan Joyce doesn't think that's the issue.
He may not think that's the issue. I don't think he actually said it was an issue. He said he didn't think it was the solution. But Qantas has wanted these restrictions removed in the past. They're anachronistic. They're the sort of thing that should have been left and gone a long time ago. Arguably, they should have been done perhaps during the previous government or even before that in the Howard government. Those are the sorts of things the government should be focusing on, freeing up the sector so it can be internationally competitive, not seeking subsidies, because in the end we know what happens. That just means that the car industry suddenly has wings and the taxpayers will foot the bill every step of the way.
Nick Champion, you are an advocate for subsidising the car industry, so presumably you would think that subsidising the airline industry, or Qantas in particular if necessary, is an okay idea?
Well, look, I think we might want to put that one to one side for the moment, whether or not we have a national carrier and whether or not we support it. I think the more curious thing is why we're having this debate. I mean, Joe Hockey rocks up to from what I understand, a private business lunch and floats this massive debate in a rather strange way. We see the share price of Qantas go upwards. And then we have the Treasurer of the country coming out and saying, oh, let's have a debate. Let's have a debate. And by the way, I don't really have a position. I kind of have a position. And this is kind of choice.
But that's consultation, isn't it?
No,
the Rudd-Gillard governments could have done the same.
No, it's not consultation. And it's not really having a debate. And it's not having a position. And we were told the adults are in charge. Well, adults have positions, and if you're an adult and you're treasurer and you want to do something, then you just stump up and say, this is the proposal.
We'll open this up in a moment, but I just want to come to you now, Tony.
And so there's a question of why are we having this debate and how are we having this debate? No real government proposal on the table, and it just left out there, frankly, to commentators and think tanks to sort of
We're having the debate because Qantas put it on the table.
Well, Tony Sheldon, let me ask you, you've got more skin in the game here than anyone around the table because you've got a lot of members that are involved and affected by what happens at Qantas. What's your view?
Well, we've got many thousands of workers right across the aviation industry, but equally importantly, we've got a national economic interest about what happens at Qantas, Virgin, Rex, a whole number of aviation services. And the real question is about how we actually get a proper industry operating within the country, because we've seen 8,000 jobs outsourced overseas. We've seen jobs within this country that have been turned to part-time. We've seen Qantas ham-fisted approach to its Jetstar Asian expansion. And we see them asking today for more money in some fashion when only 3 weeks ago they were putting $60 million of Qantas hard, cold cash into Jetstar Japan. So one of the critical things that Joe Hockey should be addressing, not over a lunch and a few drinks, he should be addressing the fact that where's this money going? Is it for the Australia's interest? If there's any change, is it in Australia's interest for employment, for our economic interests, or is it just money that can be flitted away in Southeast Asia and a failed operation in Jetstar?
Well, Kelly O'Dwyer thinks that industrial relations reform in relation to the airlines is something that could be considered. How's your response to that?
I totally agree with it. And quite clearly, where a company can put 100,000 passengers without any warning to the general public and close it down, lose $200 million the same year as a result of that cavalier approach, very ideologically driven, strand nearly 2,000 children around the world unaccompanied, and say that's just part of doing business, then we have to do reforms. We have a company who can turn around and just last few weeks ago decide that 1,400 employees are now part-time, which gives them $200 a week below the minimum wage, when they can actually give people decent jobs in an aviation industry that can successfully operate in this country. What we're seeing at Qantas, and that is that we're seeing a cross-subsidisation, the sweating of the brand, the sweating of their planes, certainly the sweating of consumers and the workforce, to fund a Southeast Asian expansion of the airline, which is failing. And it's failing to...
But Qantas would argue that Jetstar is their more profitable arm, yet you're saying that that is one of the problems. Well,
there's a lot of commentators that say that Jetstar in Asia and that expansion is a failure, and the $60 million that was put out over to Jetstar Japan just 3 weeks ago is an example of that. But what Qantas is failing to do, and has repeatedly failed to do, and it's not required actually under our accounting principles, what they failed to do was say where the cross-subsidisation goes from Qantas to Jetstar, except 3 weeks ago. So now we've got to foot the bill for the expansion in Japan. Now, that comes back to a question about how the airline's been run, not a question about whether the laws are wrong, because quite clearly we bequeathed 20 years ago a debt-free airline to the private sector under certain conditions. And that's critically important, that they keep their word, keep their honesty to the Australian public, and have a company that is intent is to look after our national interests, as well as profitability. Both are important.
Do we have to face up to the reality that the successful international airlines tend to have large amounts of government ownership? Tim Wilson, I saw a tweet that you did earlier today talking about the idea that you might shift your business to Virgin Blue if taxpayers' funds go into Qantas. But Virgin Blue receives an inordinate amount of taxpayers' funds just from overseas nations. So you would be, if you did that, supporting a taxpayer-funded overseas airline above a taxpayer-funded Australian airline.
Well, first we need to state that Twitter corrected me. It's no longer called Virgin Blue. Apparently it's called Virgin Australia. Yes, that would be true, but except for the fact that that would be foreigners subsidising my travel. If they want to do that, more the power to them. The issue we have is what we have control over in this country. And the question is, do we want to have our taxpayers' dollars going towards supporting an airline which maybe, I don't know all the details around the individual transactions, but maybe Tony's right. Maybe there are serious issues around management within the company. Further evidence about why we shouldn't be then tipping money in subsidies. My big concern is that the management of Qantas and the unions have got together and said they want to focus on getting subsidies because that is the way...
Do you have any evidence of that, or is that just
No, I'm saying that's my concern. And I've heard other people raise that concern as well, that they've done a deal which is to focus on the subsidies because there's simply no basis for Alan Joyce to have discarded completely the investment component and investment liberalisation component as a potential, at least, component of the solution for this problem.
Kelly O'Dwyer, I saw you nodding when Tim Wilson said that. You agree that it's odd that Alan Joyce would discard that so quickly?
Well, I haven't heard all his comments, but if that is the case, that he has completely discarded it, then I would agree. You know, I do find that a little bit odd. But just picking up on a point that Tony made earlier about you know, the industrial relations component to do with Qantas, you know, I think the truth, you know, the agreements that people are on, the legacy agreements that people are on at Qantas are very different to the agreements that people are on with a number of different airlines, including those that are competitors.
Better conditions.
Well, they're different conditions, and I suppose, you know, one of the questions for the TWU is whether or not they want to continue to be able to dictate to an airline airline exactly how they're going to run it. They want to be involved in the management decisions of an airline. And, you know, frankly, if that's going to be the operating model, of course, it's not going to be as competitive as other airlines around the world. And I think that's one of the big problems.
Some of the most successful companies in the world, Southwest Airlines is a great example, where they have a very strong partnership between the workforce, their elected representatives and the company.
Partnerships are fine. It's unions dictating to management that I have a problem with.
I think you're really trying to change the subject, because reality is partnerships do work, and what you're suggesting is, and similar to Tim, and that is that anything that smells of the workplace having representatives that can actually speak up on behalf of the workers is somehow wrong.
That's as much a myth as you're arguing that the Qantas management representing. The simple fact is,
very clear conclusion
it's
as well.
the difference between the structures in terms of people's workplace models. Even Jetstar has a different arrangement.
If you're saying that there's an unfairness in the market because of what wages are being paid across the market in the aviation industry, then I'd be the last person to say that, in actual fact, I'd be the first person to agree with you to say that we should actually have a fair rate for the work you do, whether you work for Virgin, whether you work for Qantas, whether you work for Rex. You should get returns for what you actually do as a performing employee. Have a fair playing field, because what Qantas argued for, they shut down the airline because they said with 65% of the domestic market that they were unfairly competing with everybody else, because some people, some of which they were actually contracting to, would get paying less. So you can't have it both ways. You actually have to say, do we want to have a fair return for the community in the aviation? We want to have planes flying in the air and not falling into the ground? And what sort of proper regulation do we want to have, rather than just leaving it to market regulation?
But then the TWU took unlawful industrial action, and you were fined as an organisation.
In actual fact, that was 3 years beforehand, and you know what? We did the right thing then, because what happened was the company reneged on deals about permanency within that workforce, and what do we see now? Your nirvana. We see 1,300 employees in the age of 40 and 50 getting 20-hour minimums, which is $200 a week below the minimum wage. And the company has said they can afford to have direct permanent employees, but they won't, because they want to churn and burn. That's their comments, because they want your nirvana, where you can turn around and just tell people what to do rather than have a partnership like Southwest Airlines.
Let's move on to another issue before we go to a break.